wanted to come introduce myself.
Can we do this, then switch the presentation and switch to this?
I don't have one with me tonight.
I do, yes.
It doesn't make any difference.
We can just open the file up.
Yeah, we can just literally, so do this, do that.
Turn me off so I can, I forget that.
Yeah, I know, it looks like a touchscreen.
It's throwing off everything. Can I use?
So just go to IE or whatever, or Chrome, yeah, exactly, Mozilla, whatever you want.
That's email. I never use online version.
It's exchange.tufts.edu.
Oh no, I hate it.
Have your phone?
It's up there, yeah. 1 second.
You ready?
Yeah, I'm pumped. I mean, it's exciting. We've been working on this for like the entire.
You guys will do fine. You want me to sign out? I already got it.
Do I have to contribute if I sit in front? Not really, right?
Oh.
Yes.
I did it. Prime. You want me to put it up now, or are you going to come down and put it on later on?
No, let's do it later.
Later? Okay, so we'll go back to this one for now.
Let's set up this. Oh, here's our
Yep.
USB drive. back
Exactly.
there.
Oh, that's fun. That one's yours?
Can you get it?
It was
Okay.
walking from the NASCAR.
So let's go back.
Over the
Okay, and then I come back.
Oops, where'd it go?
So when
All you'll have to do is hit escape.
I hit escape or he does?
No, I will do it.
You do.
Oh, okay. Okay,
I
yeah.
do not want to have
Perfect.
No, no, don't worry about it.
All right,
I
cool.
think I would mess it up.
No, I know. That's
You got it. All right.
Wojtolowski? Wojtolowski. Fyodor Wojtolowski. It's a very complicated name for me to pronounce. Wojtolowski. Okay. It's good.
Well, I don't want words. No, I don't want to like. I'll be like.
Words.
Oh, yeah. Okay. All right. Let's tell you.
Not really impressed with the seating arrangement yet.
I told the army guys, they just didn't listen. Well, I feel bad. Like I don't want to know what to do. I see what I'm saying.
Alright, this is the award. So you don't have to introduce Fyodor. No, Haruka.
You want to fill this place out?
I'm not giving you. I'm not giving you.
No,
Whatever is necessary.
Haruka.
Wait, is
Whatever is best.
before my thing or after?
It's like right here. It's right here.
Oh, okay. So I just sit down.
Or
Or do I just
You get
or you
part
could
of
or
it,
you could do front row.
and then she's
Whichever
gonna
is.
come and do the award.
Down the front row.
Okay.
Come on, Joanne.
Yes.
stand up and get the award?
Yes.
And okay, and then so like she's gonna do her thing. They're gonna clap.
Yes,
And
and
then-
he may say a couple words, but it's not time for his,
And not know that she was doing that.
and it's not time for his talk, and then you'll do the intro.
Perfect.
Okay, so you can explain that to him just so not that, but we're going to give you the award, and then we're going to do the panel.
Yeah, I'll go
Like,
talk to
just
her.
make it 2 separate pieces. Where is Haruka?
My bad.
This is the stuff that stresses me out.
My life.
But if you're throwing a party, shock.
Aw, I had to hear 10 minutes early. Where's everybody?
I'm complicated.
American.
That's weird. I can do it.
When Matt was like, I'm half
Cutting it close.
That's part. He said it multiple times. Like he continues to say like
Like, what do you mean?
he needs to say I'm part friend.
Theodore.
Wojtalowski.
Or he just needs to choose to. I feel like that's the
Haruka.
We need you.
So you're going to begin the evening. You're going to begin this part of the evening. It just starts with you. Yeah, giving the award. Here's the award. So after you finish it, you're going to take it out and you're going to read it, okay?
Take off the plastic.
Or maybe not.
Huh? This one is in one piece. Okay.
Okay, good.
So you read it. Okay, hold it against something like that so you can see it. Okay. Hmm? Okay.
He's also on this panel.
Huh?
So he's also on this panel, so he'll like.
Yeah, he's gonna sit right here.
There.
Okay. So. Alright, so let me know. So I'll let you know when to start. Okay? Alright. You should stay right there.
sorry. Oh.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I just wasn't very into discussion.
Do in my opinion.
Lorenzo and Atre. All these military people just came in.
We're working on it.
What are they supposed to do?
Yeah, everybody low and in the center.
We're working on it.
They were like, boop. They didn't.
You going to a party after?
Why are you being weird?
Okay, leave me alone. Hey, is it possible if you guys can do
I
just wanted everyone to get.
I don't understand. It's so hard. See, that was more.
Yeah, because it's not my direction. I'm just messing with you. Of course,
Yeah, but Lorenzo, if you were to like just talk to me in general, would you ever talk this close to my face?
I didn't talk that close to their face.
You really did. It was like a menacing theme.
Well, alright. I'm gonna set up from cock, but there might be. What time? I want to see 9:30. Yeah.
I was gonna ask you.
What's up?
Can you take a photo for me and? Yeah.
Right now?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Do you want to put it with
We chat a little bit.
Ah. Okay.
Look at y'all. Y'all made it.
I'll come down.
Do you want me to open it for you? Just like,
keep it open.
yeah, just leave it open.
Yeah.
Just like,
Eliminate any possibility.
yeah, just leave it open. Just breaks the award.
Да, мы с военными.
Just like that.
Yeah.
Have your panelists in.
Okay, thank you.
This is me, I think.
Good evening.
Yeah. You are further and then you are third. Yeah. You're gonna have to.
Good evening. Welcome and welcome back to the final session of the 2018 EPIIC Symposium. I'm Haruka Noishiki from Japan, a first year at Tufts intending to major in International Relations, Cognitive and Brain Sciences, and French. I am delighted to welcome back Dr. Fyodor Wojtolowski and present him with this evening's Robert and Joanne Bendiston Public Diplomacy Award. The generous support of the Bendiston family has made possible many invaluable connections between students and leaders in diplomacy and global affairs. And the award is given to those leaders who are willing to share their perspectives with students in events such as the EPIIC Symposium. There could not be one more suited to receive this award than Dr. Wojtolowski, who has joined us for his second symposium, having spoken at the 2015 Symposium on Russia in the 21st Century. Dr. Fyodor Wojtolowski is the director of the Primakov Institute of World Economy and International Relations, IMIMO, located in Moscow. The institute, founded by the Russian Academy of Sciences, is a non-profit organization which acts under the charter of the Academy. The institute strives to expand analytical resources to serve political decision makers and cooperates with federal and regional governmental bodies, mass media, and major public and private organizations. IMIMO rightfully prides itself in taking an independent stance on polarizing issues from 21st century liberalism, crisis or revival, to the prospects of socioeconomic development of the United States after the crisis of 2008 to 2009. Dr. Wojtolowski's work as director illuminates his commitment to bring precision and accuracy to a wealth of information integral to forming international relations and working with existing systems. Dr. Wojtolowski's keen eye and commitment to understanding difficult international relations has rendered him a prized academic. He has served as a professor of political science at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations since 2008. Dr. Wojtolowski has used the power of his pen to better international relations. He has authored IMIMO's Strategic Global Forecast 2030, and he received the first prize medal from the Russian Academy of Sciences for his monograph, Unity and Division of the West, published in 2009. His research interests have been mainly focused on U.S. foreign and security policies in the Asia-Pacific, U.S.-Russia and U.S.-China relations, and transatlantic relations. His expertise in such fields extends beyond the immediate reality that faces us to the implications in decision-making of world leaders, as seen in his remarks at this afternoon's panel. His commitment to understanding the whole picture of international relations, particularly that of U.S.-Russia relations, can be traced back to his doctoral thesis, Ideology and Practices of Atlanticism in U.S. Foreign Policy. The award I have the pleasure to present to Dr. Wojtolowski today, the Robert and Joanne Bendiston Public Diplomacy Award, was created to recognize those who serve through diplomacy and reconciliation efforts and by redressing inequalities and inequities around the world. Dr. Wojtolowski's work at the IMIMO and beyond renders him more than deserving of such public recognition. In this time of heightened tensions between Russia and the U.S., this award celebrates those who work to bridge this relationship between the two world powers, often at odds. As the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, Amina Mohammed, in her keynote earlier today said, "The world indeed is a mess, but we have tools that people like Dr. Wojtolowski tirelessly continue to create and to mold to fit the state of the world." I cannot fully express how fortunate we are to have Dr. Wojtolowski join us again this EPIIC Symposium. Please join me in recognizing Dr. Fyodor Wojtolowski. The Robert and Joanne Bendiston Public Diplomacy Award is awarded to Dr. Fyodor Wojtolowski in recognition of your distinguished career as a public intellectual seeking to bring greater understanding to the Russia-United States dialogue throughout the world.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Take a picture.
Yes, with pleasure. Thank you very much. If I may, I would like to say a few words. First of all, it's a great honor for me, and it's a great honor for me to be here and to get such a significant award. I'm very grateful to Tufts University. I'm very grateful to Cabot Foundation for inviting me, and I'm very grateful to Bandeston family for giving me such honor. But it's a great thing to be here, and I would like to say that it's a special honor for me because throughout my life, my academic life, since 2003, when I joined EPIIC as a junior researcher and PhD student, I have been working on the United States. I have been writing about the US foreign policy, Russian-American relations, and it's a great event for me to be in one of the best American universities and to receive an award for public diplomacy for my efforts engaged into and invested into Russian-American relations. So I hope that what I have done for these years have invested a little to or have some real practical influence on the development of Russian-American relations. I'm an academic person. I'm writing books, I'm writing articles, but in current world, we academics are becoming a little bit more than only researchers. And this, the formula of this award, the public diplomacy award, means that academics in this world are becoming a little bit diplomats, are becoming people who are communicating with each other, are negotiating on very complicated issues on which sometimes diplomats do not have enough, space to talk openly. We can talk. We have this privilege. And I want to address to all young scientists here, to all future academicians here, to all people who are engaged in international studies and international relations. I think that in current world, in contemporary world, we are becoming something very significant, much more significant than we used to be before. Because on the one hand, academic people can give advices to the decision makers, and it's a very significant role. And it's the role they have played during decades, but right now in the more complicated, more interdependent world, this role is becoming more and more significant because we can provide deeper analysis of not only of current situation, we can suggest alternatives. What we are doing at EPIIC for many years, we're suggesting alternatives. And we're suggesting alternatives also on Russian-American relations to current course and to current situation we're having. What else we can do, academics? We can do so-called track 2 diplomacy. We can communicate with each other. We can negotiate on very complicated issues, as I mentioned before, on very, very sharp sometimes issues on which officials do not have authority to talk. We are responsible scholars. So let's use this irresponsibility and to provide officials who are responsible with ideas. We can exchange on many issues they cannot exchange openly because there are always limits for diplomats to talk about something, and we do not have such limits. What we can do also, we can provide ideas not only for politics, we can provide ideas for education system. We can teach people. You know, Henry Kissinger, last year he was at Primakov Readings, the conference MMO is holding every year, he has been asked how he sees his role in the world right now when he's very prominent academician and former official. He said, I'm educator, and I see this role as my principal role. So all academicians should be educators, communicators, and analysts to bring reality to decision makers, to explain them reality, and to suggest alternatives, and to communicate with our colleagues around the world. So I'm very happy to be here, and I also want to say that it's great honor for me as a professional. So thank you very much.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Matthew Jourlet, and I am a member of this year's EPIIC class. I am a French, American, and Canadian freshman majoring in international relations and economics. I am pleased to welcome you to our panel on the role of the United States in the liberal world order, past, present, and future. We will discuss the U.S.'s position in a liberal world order, challenges to U.S. influence, and the domestic problems that pose difficulties to full U.S. leadership on a global scale. Historically, the United States has been at the heart of the current world order, stemming from its central role in the formation of international institutions after World War II, its promotion of democracy, its unparalleled military, and strong economic development. With the fall of the Berlin Wall and the internal collapse of the Soviet Union, Francis Fukuyama even went so far as to famously proclaim that we had reached the end of history. But, as we saw in our afternoon panel, this may not be the case. Despite this acclamation and apparent triumph of US-led liberalism, recent history has shown us that the US's position in a liberal world order is substantially changing, both due to external as well as internal factors. The United States must contend with new transnational threats in a much more multilateral manner. As we have learned through other panels, populism, the rise of illiberal states, the nuclear threat, faltering alliances, the socioeconomic equality have led both sides of the political spectrum in the United States to question the US's role and position in the international system. Are we faced with the choice of embracing multilateralism that engages transnational threats through international institutions, or hunkering down, reaffirming our sovereignty, and risk losing global influence? Or are there alternatives? This panel will ask whether or not America could or should regain its role in the liberal world order. We will look at the competing doctrines of US isolationist sovereignty and liberal internationalism in order to understand the US retreat from international institutions, international trade, and international agreements such as the Paris Climate Accord. We will also attempt to understand the global effects the United States retreat may have on power dynamics and the possibility of conflict. Before we begin, here is a brief overview of how this panel will work. Each panelist has been asked to give opening remarks for 12 minutes. Our timer will turn yellow when 2 minutes are remaining. Following that, we will open the panel to discussion among our speakers and then open it up to the audience for a question and answer period. I would now like to introduce our distinguished panelists. Daniel Dresner is a professor of international politics at the Fletcher School, a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and a contributing editor at the Washington Post. Daniel Benaim has served as a speechwriter and policy advisor at the White House, State Department, and US Senate. He is currently a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress and a visiting professor at New York University. Anthony Dworkin is a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, where he leads the organization's work in the area of human rights, democracy, and justice. And last but not least, Fyodor Voitilovsky currently serves as the director of the Primatov Institute of World Economy and International Relations of the Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow. Dan Dresner.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming on a Saturday night. I will try to be under the 12-minute mark. So I'm going to talk basically about the degree to which the Trump administration has adhered to or has broken off from liberal internationalism or the liberal international order, because to be fair, I think it's an unsettled question still. And it's worth pointing out in advance that to some extent the liberal international order for the United States, you can argue, served U.S. foreign policy relatively well for 70 years, that the world looks more like the United States now than it did in 1945 when the order was originally set up, regardless of what you think, whether you think that's a good thing or not. And it certainly augments American soft power, and you know, among other things, I would argue the order prevented balancing behavior when the United States did things like, let's say, invade countries that without UN authorization or what have you. But that said, there were cons to the order, and you can argue that led to some of the things that happened in 2016. The U.S. seemed to shoulder more of the burden in terms of providing global public goods than many of its allies and or many of its partners. All policies, you know, globalization certainly played a role, you could argue, in fostering some degree of economic inequality in the United States, not to mention wage stagnation. And you could argue that other countries, particularly China and Russia, at best only partially signed on to this order, and in some cases more actively acted like spoilers, which also in some ways imposed more difficulties in terms of the United States in terms of sustaining it. So here comes Donald Trump running for president in 2016. And Donald Trump, in terms of foreign policy, was genuinely unique in terms of what he was saying. There's a lot of stuff you could say about Trump in terms of whether or not he believes one thing or another and whether he'll hold the same position from one tweet to the next. But it would be a mistake to assume that Donald Trump has no core convictions when it comes to foreign policy. He actually does. He clearly, among other things, sees the world, particularly the global economy, through a zero-sum lens. He is a stone-cold mercantilist, and this week's tweets/policy pronouncements are certainly evidence of that. He believes, to bluntly put, that the liberal international order is screwing over the United States. He thinks that without question, the United States has devoted far too much effort to sustain this order, and that somehow everyone else has gotten rich. Trump also believes in some sort of crude issue linkage, in which because the United States is the largest economy in the world, and because we've suffered so much, that essentially the U.S. can somehow threaten to withdraw from certain things, and in return get others to make concessions of one kind or another. And I think this has been reflected in his rhetoric, most obviously in his inaugural address, where he said the following: "We've defended other nations' borders while refusing to defend our own, and spent trillions of dollars overseas while America's infrastructure has fallen into disrepair and decay. The wealth of our middle class has been ripped from their homes and then redistributed across the entire world." Now, that's not necessarily true, but nonetheless, the rhetoric is quite powerful. And this was reflected, by the way, in terms of his campaign, you can argue, in the fact that he had great difficulty attracting anyone of quality in terms of advising with respect to foreign policy. Frankly put, if Sebastian Gorka is the best you can do, you're not doing very well when it comes to this sort of advice. You know, or Carter Page or George Papadopoulos. This is not exactly the A team or the B team or the C team when it comes to foreign policy. And to be fair to Trump, he also inherited a situation that was extremely ripe for change, which is to say that polarization within the United States has caused much of what normally, you know, how foreign policy normally functioned to be that much more difficult, which is, you know, in terms of negotiating trade agreements, you would ordinarily get Congress to pass something. And Congress was generally thought to be a co-equal branch when it comes to coordinating foreign policy. But polarization had become so high during the Obama years that the Obama administration wound up pursuing a number of its most important foreign policy initiatives without much in the way of congressional buy-in, because among other things, they couldn't get congressional passage of certain things. Whether it was the opening to Cuba and lifting of sanctions, or to a lesser extent, the Iran deal, and certainly on climate change. And so this made it extremely easy, potentially, for Trump to reverse course. Now, has Trump actually done this? And you can certainly argue there are obvious examples of this. The withdrawal from the Paris Climate Change Accords, or from TPP, or from UNESCO. The notion of tying immigration to national security, which certainly contravenes how the U.S. normally thinks of this stuff. Trying his best to sabotage the Iran deal, or moving the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And it's certainly reflected in the rhetoric that Trump has articulated, and a relatively extraordinary op-ed that H.R. McMaster and Gary Cohn published in the Wall Street Journal that I think is actually the most concise articulation of exactly what the Trump foreign policy is, in which they said, let's just face it, it's an anarchic, Hobbesian, dog-eat-dog world out there, and we are looking forward to competing in that world, which has a kind of layer of truth, and yet in other ways is just dramatically wrong. But that said, there's also ways in which Trump has been frustrated in terms of trying to do what he wanted to do. And indeed, in some ways, the tariff announcement this week is an example of that, because he did it without vetting it through any of the sort of processes through which you would ordinarily do this. And it reflects Trump's tendency to say things and then not realize that there's a process required to actually doing them. He staffed his administration with a variety of internationals, including people like Jim Mattis or Gary Cohn. Many of the nationalists that he's hired, either Steve Bannon or Sebastian Gorka or Michael Flynn, are now no longer there. And indeed, in terms of the rhetoric, if you look at what's said in the national security strategy or the national defense strategy, you could tweak about 2% of it, and it would not look all that out of place, I think, had the Obama administration done it, or had a titular, a theoretical Clinton administration articulated it. And there are other areas where, in fact, Trump has pursued the exact same policy that I suspect Hillary Clinton would have pursued, whether we're talking about Afghanistan or not withdrawing from NAFTA. So there are ways in which Trump's foreign policy could have been worse relative to the liberal international order. If you look at the U.S. policy on ISIS, it's been a continuation of what the Obama administration did, and I don't really think the Clinton administration would have done that much different. You've seen a strengthening of sanctions against North Korea that, among other things, secured UN Security Council buy-in. You see NATO commitments to boost spending, which, among others, Obama administration officials had been castigating. That said, there's been obvious differences. For one thing, there's been the complete and total collapse of American soft power as we know it, whether reflected in sort of public opinion polls, whether we're talking about Pew or Gallup or what have you. There's also been a failure, by the way, of the Trump administration to pursue or improve ties, I think, with Russia and or with China. And this is, potentially problematic. What I find more disturbing, however, frankly, is the trajectory, which is what's going to be happening going forward. If anything we can tell from Trump, first, Trump has genuinely personalized foreign policy in a way that I don't think I've seen it in my lifetime, which is to say that Trump equates a successful American foreign policy literally with whether or not people are treating him personally well. We saw this in his trip to Saudi Arabia, and who can forget the orb? And we saw this in China, where, ever since that trip, he's been, sort of impressed with how well they treated him. And indeed, to some extent, you can argue that part of the reason Emmanuel Macron has managed to pursue a better foreign policy towards the United States is because, in contrast to, let's say, Angela Merkel, is because Macron quickly recognized that the way to deal with Trump is to just flatter him and, have a nice military parade or something. So the result of this has been, the foreign policy has been bad enough so that you've seen what I would describe as a true hemorrhaging of foreign policy assets, meaning the essential withdrawal or departure of an awful lot of the top tier of America's diplomatic corps. Something like 60% of what we would consider the State Department's equivalent of generals have left in the first year of the Trump administration. That is not good. And more disturbingly, we're now operating in a world where, in some ways, we're dealing with America the dispensable, as opposed to America the indispensable. Madeleine Albright, I think, was the one who described America as the indispensable nation when she was Secretary of State. And one of the things I think we're seeing now is a recognition by the rest of the world that although they don't like Donald Trump, they don't necessarily, they're finding ways to work around him. Which is to say that sort of Trump's erosion of credible commitments on things like NATO Article 5 or certainly commitments to the WTO have caused states to try to seek alternatives. And so even a country like Canada, which to be blunt should be concerned about what the United States says and does in terms of relative power, you're now having things like Canada's foreign minister saying we need to look for new partners. We need to talk about a free trade deal with China. And the fact that Canada is part of the TPP-11 has made them, frankly, a little more resistant to any pressure from the Trump administration. And to put this delicately, if the United States can't pressure Canada, we can't pressure anyone. We're really bad at it then. And worse, I think you're seeing a transfer of what I would call hypocritical power. So one of the things the United States, I think, one of the advantages the United States had during much of the Cold War and post-Cold War period was that the United States could say, hey, you other countries, do what we say and not what we do. And the United States certainly adhered in the main, I think, to the norms of the liberal international order, and yet there were various times where the United States sort of violated these rules in a variety of ways. You could argue that hypocritical power is the ability of a country to get others to buy into its rhetoric, even when those countries are aware that the person making the rhetoric isn't necessarily 100% committed to it. Trump, by being who he is, has actually sort of, completely stripped off the artifice of a notion of a commitment to a liberal international order. And the result is that you now have someone like Xi Jinping being able to go to Davos and saying, we, the Chinese, are going to be responsible stakeholders and stewards of the liberal international order, which is kind of sort of true and kind of sort of crap. Because if you actually take a look at the ways in which the Chinese, structure their foreign economic policy, yeah, they adhere to the rules, to the letter of the law, but they don't always adhere to the spirit. And so, in some ways, they also now have hypocritical power that they did not before. And so as a result, I do fear that in some ways we're in the worst of all worlds, which is that I don't think Trump has actually been able to articulate a viable, coherent vision of what his world looks like in a way that is in any way appealing to anyone else. So literally, America first is America alone in this kind of world. And again, we're seeing that from, among other things, Canada's behavior. And I do think that the internationalists operating within the Trump administration have managed to prevent, in some ways, the worst of things from happening. But on the other hand, they haven't necessarily moved the ball forward either. And so the analogy I would make to the sort of U.S. stewardship under Trump of the liberal international order is, imagine someone getting into a car that they bought and deciding, I'm going to floor the accelerator and just drive as long as I can, and I'm not going to bother with things like filling up the gas tank or changing the oil or changing the wiper fluid or getting the car maintenanced in any way whatsoever. You can get away with that for a while. You can drive pretty fast for a while, and then eventually something's going to break down. So we're only in 13 months into this administration, and so far things are starting to break down, but we haven't seen a full breakdown. And to end on that cheery note, I'm worried that that's what we're going to be seeing. So thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Benaim.
Thanks. Well, I find myself in violent agreement with my predecessor here. I think that one area of potential hope is that the President Trump doesn't seem to have as much influence as you might expect in the Trump administration, which may be helpful. So this has been a fantastic conference. I've really enjoyed being here with you guys. It really wasn't that long ago that I was sitting on the other side of this room looking out at the speaker, which makes me feel very glad to see you guys here on a Saturday night, knowing, at least based on my own experience, that your own time out in the world doing foreign policy will come much sooner than you might expect. And I only hope that at some point we stop making your job harder hour by hour, if and when you do. I think yesterday when the wind was howling and the rain was pouring, I was thinking that I've rarely been to a conference where the weather outside so perfectly matched the mood indoors. But I feel like now, the sun came out today a little bit, and the storm passed, and maybe there's a lesson there too in terms of projecting too far forward from the presence. As Dr. Williams and I were talking about, there's an old saying in political speech writing, which was one of the things that I used to do, which is that, and it's useful when you're the last speaker at a conference like this, and that everything important has already been said, but not everybody has said it yet. So I'm going to try not to repeat too much of that, other than to second a lot of what Professor Dresner has said, and talk a little bit from experience about this. What it's like as a policymaker to experience this thing called the U.S.-led liberal international order. You can't touch it, you can't taste it, you can't see it, feel it. It's just sort of out there. It's this abstraction, and everyone kind of says, well, the liberal order is fraying. And it's one of these funny things where international relations professionals do this. They pick a word, and they just use it and use it and use it until it loses its meaning. I personally think it's less like a kind of tablecloth, American leadership, less like a tablecloth that sits over the world, and more like a set of magnetic fields that kind of repel some things and attract others and order metal filings in their field and act very differently at different distances and different removes from American power. And just in terms of what this thing is, was, will be, which we're talking about, and I think there will be a will be, which I'm optimistic about that, is that it was never really, this liberal international order was never really global, exactly. It never had a full hegemony over the entire world. It was never quite as liberal as the liberal international order might seem. It was never quite as orderly as the liberal international order might seem. It was sometimes honored in the breach, and yet for many people in many places it had a great deal of tractor power, of magnetism that pulled countries toward open market systems, toward democratic systems, into security arrangements that really created significant peace and prosperity. So I wanted to talk just a little bit about what it's like to be kind of at the pointy end of the spear of American foreign policy, sort of flying into a place, what this thing looks like when you fly into a place that says the United States of America on the belly of a plane, and you're in there thinking about, well, what are you going to do when you land? What does this order that's sort of an abstraction feel like? And I was thinking about landing in South Korea, which I did a couple of times in government, working for Vice President Biden and Secretary Clinton. And I was thinking about, this was before President Trump announced unilateral steel tariffs on South Korea. I was thinking about a place that literally bets its life on a United States security guarantee day after day, year after year, decade after decade. A place that, by buying into this idea of export-led growth and democratization, really it became an economic powerhouse. A place that 60 years ago was so poor that it used to send young South Korean men to do construction work in richer countries like Yemen. So, and you look across the demilitarized zone, as I was lucky to do once with Vice President Biden, me as a sleep-deprived staffer, him with like a bad-looking kind of leather jacket and shades, like looking through flipping up the shades and looking through the binocular. And you realize that this magnetic field kind of abruptly ends right there. And on the other side of it is a power that can threaten and can indeed deter and survive, but can't inspire in that same way. And kind of looming over the horizon at this point are both the growth of China and this question of what this future of Asia will be, but also this more immediate question of are we going to do okay in the near term given the choppy relationship with the United States? But you look at a case like Korea and you see you realize just how much peace, security, economic growth, middle-class lives that would not have been otherwise have been made possible by this U.S.-led order, however you kind of see it, touch it, feel it when you get to South Korea. But it looks very different, as I'm sure my panelists will agree, when you get to a place like Ukraine, a place where in the western part of the country, there was a sense of magnetic pull also, that felt a magnetic pull into this idea of a kind of order, a kind of European order, a kind of democratic order, a kind of open market order, as opposed to a kind of more oligarchic and corrupt system. But alongside that reality, that sort of dream of an open market idea, was this great power competition reality that Ukrainians are living in all the time, as their country is ripped apart by persistent violence. And I, in government, on one of these experiences, had a chance to walk in the Maidan, which is the Ukrainian Revolutionary Square, which was full of, at that time, kind of drunk, celebrating soldiers, which was both sort of happy and slightly nerve-wracking experience. But knowing that many of those guys are now probably in the Donbass and the eastern part of the country, and knowing how hard it is, even when there's some demand among a population, to take protest and to take ferment, which you'll see is something that is happening in many places for many reasons, and translate it into progress or institution building or sort of stability or peace. Ukraine kind of lives both of those stories in a sort of blurred vision, that desire to be part of that order story, and then also this very real great power competition. And then I think about a place that, and don't be too jealous, but I do have the chance regularly to visit Iraq. I think about what it means to be there in this place that in some ways is a signal failure of the liberal international order, and particularly of the U.S. respect for the rules of the international order and the decision to invade. And, Iraq, when you're in Iraq, the magnetic field feels different. In Iraq, this magnetic field that is the American-led order feels like the ability to marshal other countries, 60 countries, 60 nations and organizations, they used to call it, which drove me nuts because those are different things, but 60 countries were part of this anti-ISIS coalition. Italian engineers you can summon to deal with the Mosul Dam in Iraq to make sure that it doesn't flood, and Spanish and Italian carabinieri who train Iraqi police. You have this ability to act, the international system can act on Iraq, but what it can't do is figure out how to actually marshal the forces within Iraq to come to some kind of peaceful arrangement. And so Iraq is just, for every meaningful purpose, outside of this order. This rules of this order don't really govern what happens on the ground. And across the Middle East, where I work most, you see this dynamic at play, where on the biggest picture, we can prevent countries from acquiring nuclear weapons. We can make sure that oil flows to the global economy. We can certainly kill terrorists, although they seem to come back in ever larger numbers. But this idea that we can create the domestic dynamics that would enlarge or expand this liberal order is just, has proven out of our reach. So, so this order, to go back to this metaphor, is indeed fraying, and I think in some places the Obama administration, which I worked in, tried to stitch it together in some places. They tried to say, okay, we can reach a diplomatic, we can mobilize all the countries in the world to create overbearing economic pressure and prevent the spread of nuclear weapons in Iran. Iran becoming a nuclear armed state, which would have had all sorts of cascading effects of proliferation. We can look at all the countries in the world and through shoe leather and persistence, get to work with China on climate change and reach this flexible, interesting thing called the Paris Accord. But it's fraying. It's fraying from great power competition. It's fraying from what I call the four horsemen of populism, which are consolidated economic inequality, demographic upheaval, unmediated communication, which we live with every day, and creaky governing institutions at every level that don't fully respond. And it's also fraying, frankly, and I feel like, again, you've heard this from other people, so I'll be brief about it. It's fraying from the unilateral decisions made in Washington to abdicate this kind of responsibility. One thing that I've learned since being where you sat is that in diplomacy, a lot of the time, the how of diplomacy matters just as much as the what. And you can have a brilliant what without resourcing or investing in the how or sending the right person, a trusted person, to do the how, and you're really sunk. And I see a lot of whats that aren't matched with hows, and a lot of diplomats who I know and respect who are 30 years my elder and have been doing this for a long time are heading for the exits in remarkable numbers, and that's something we'll have to deal with for a long time. I think we'll need a future amnesty program or a reconstruction conference for U.S. diplomats. But I would say don't count out the United States. I would warn against counting out the United States or the future of this order as it exists, which is worth fighting for. Was never quite what it was sold to be at the beginning, but is still more than it's being sold to be now. Buy low, I would say, on America's leadership in the international order for what could happen next if we are lucky enough to get to the next that we want. Because I see a few things. First of all, I see no real replacement order, no replacement rationale that is likely to supplant this role. People have talked a great deal here about China and the ways in which China benefits from the international order and its desire to amend and participate in that order instead of fully upend it. Russia, I think in some cases is the same way. In some cases seeks to act as a spoiler, and in some cases raises some very trenchant and compelling critiques of the international order as it's been practiced that are worth listening to. But I don't see it as a pure rival at the level of creating a different global order and changing the fundamental nature of the international system. Although people are working around the president, as Professor Dresner said, they still in many ways look to America as a problem solver of first resort, or they did as recently as November 2016, and I think they probably still do and will again in short order when it comes to something like Ebola or climate or ISIS. There's still not another set of actors that can mobilize to face transnational, transcendent problems without the United States. And I think we're getting better at solving these kinds of problems despite the challenges of global politics. which was evident to me in the Paris Accords, which are kind of built on this flexible geometry of, okay, we can't get everybody to agree on the same thing, so let's create this sort of more voluntary system. And it's got weaknesses, but it's also a sign that this system can be adaptable and nimble. And so is the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, which shows that others can be nimble and adaptive too in terms of how they deal with this system. But I think that as you look forward, the struggle is not just, this fight that's ahead to protect the system is not an academic fight in some ways, as much as it is a political fight. And what happens next matters incredibly. You know, I think we have to basically recognize more than ever the links between domestic and international when it comes to foreign policy. You know, when it comes to the practice of foreign policy in other countries and when it comes to the practice and selling of foreign policy in our own country. As a speechwriter, as I said, as an institutionalist and a member of the previous administration, I love technocratic international liberal orderism. I really do. I love it. I think it's a great way to run the world. As a speechwriter who knows what happened after, I feel like we have to recognize that that this technocratic ideal may not be enough to stand next to blood and soil in the boxing ring and win. You know, and that maybe every time the words liberal international order are uttered, a Trump supporter or a Brexiter is born somewhere. So we have to think about that. Vice President Biden used to say to me, Dan, read that sentence and call your aunt. If she can't understand it, you probably need to rewrite it. And I think that's advice as a writer, but this is a political contest in some ways. It really is. And we have to, that means, as Tarun Chhabra, who sat up here earlier, said today, in some ways we have to politicize foreign policy more, which goes maybe against this technocratic ethos. We have to find some way to understand that the counterweight to America Firstism can't be a purely technocratic and institutionalist one. It has to be sort of values grounded, and it has to meet people where they are. And it has to recognize this mismatch between the international and domestic sides of our policy. The international side that embraces this, or has embraced this sort of integration, ever greater integration and openness, and the domestic side which has refused to provide the social programs which would support and which would build the social contract that would allow that. I think countries that want to address those issues have to find a way to address them in tandem. We have to do big things at home, in other words, if we want to do big things in the world increasingly, or that gap, I think, will lead us to more political problems. So we need to find some way to kind of create new syntheses here. I think big projects, like I said, and a kind of galvanizing force, the fact that you guys are here listening to the likes of me at 8:39 on a Saturday night suggests to me that maybe there's less complacency than some people believe about the fate of the liberal international order. But somehow we need to create a different world, and we need to build new accords, new ideas, new domestic political consensus behind ideas that have become newly contested. You know, it's a long time ago, but FDR used the technology of his time, the fireside chat by radio, to unite people and to unite Americans dealing with some very organized people on the other side with some big, not so good ideas for the world. Now it's much more fragmented, and people are using technology, including our leaders, to pit Americans against each other. I guess my hope for the future is that we find some way to get to a place where we can try to rebuild that consensus domestically, which I really believe is the key for the kinds of things that we need to do in the world. And really, like, none of this happens without a deeply engaged U.S. At the center of it. Otherwise, the amount of creativity required and the amount of centrifugal force on the system may be just sort of too big, which is why I think probably it's true that one Trump administration is something that the international order can survive, but I'm not sure that a second and a third that turn this sort of single occasion into a new normal won't cause a great deal more hedging if he's reelected and others are elected after that. Yeah, I'm pleased to see you guys all here, and I feel like I said, I think we're making it all harder for you week by week in terms of the world that you'll inherit as policymakers, but I hope you won't hold that against us, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks very much. So I just want to say it's, in passing, this has been a fantastic conference, and I've been really grateful to be here. I have a colleague who says that the key to a successful panel is for the panelists to disagree with each other. Unfortunately, I'm largely in agreement with what's been said so far. So
we're counting on you, Fyodor.
A heavy burden is going to be passed on to Fyodor here. But at least I'm going to say it in a different accent. And I thought, building on that, I would try and give a perspective from Europe about the U.S. role in the liberal international order and how that's changing and may continue to change. Despite what you may have heard, Britain does still count as part of Europe. So we're not leaving Europe, even if we are leaving the EU. I can prove my European credentials through my jet lag, because I'm still on European time, so you'll have to bear with me for that. So I'm going to start with a very brief history from the European point of view of, these things have been discussed already a bit, but the kind of evolving nature of the international order that we see, and this is partly as Daniel did. I mean, actually, I can refer to both I can say Daniel, and it'll be ambiguous which one said it. This one said that it's a kind of complicated and rather amorphous thing, the liberal order. I think we can see two phases. Phase one, which was the immediate post-World War II era, effectively there was a system of collective security set up based around the UN, and kind of overlaid on top of that was the kind of the West, the defense of the West, the Atlantic Alliance, where Europe was really, kind of recovering from and having its political and economic systems kind of preserved and developed under American protection, effectively, under American tutelage. Europe was really the kind of front line in a kind of global standoff in which the United States was playing the leading part. So Europe was front and center, and the US commitment to Europe was really kind of where the action was. After the end of the Cold War, post-'89, we moved to, I think, the second phase of this history. And, essentially, kind of to try and summarize a complex historical process, very simply, I think there was a kind of an attempt, a settlement, and a kind of a US policy with which Europe was basically in agreement that tried to kind of expand and roll out the settlement that had existed within the Atlantic Alliance West onto a global scale. And this was, went by various names, but enlargement was one of the kind of catchphrases that people came up with to describe this. This was a process which never really reached its end goal. And this is a point, I guess, that has already been made. It was a kind of aspirational idea based on a series of kind of aims, values, and a gamble, I think. And it's a process that advanced in a kind of inconsistent and somewhat staggered way. It had incomplete results, it had internal tensions, and to some degree it relied on a bet that by linking the countries of the world, including emerging and kind of evolving powers which were not yet liberal, that they could be kind of pulled in an internally liberal direction, and this could then consolidate, the international order. In a sense, the order would pull these countries towards liberalism, and then their kind of evolving liberalism would help support the order in turn. And, during the 1990s, I think there was a period when it seemed possible that this might actually happen. And alongside this, there was a kind of hope, which, again, I think didn't quite make it to being much more than that, that we could use security cooperation internationally in a different kind of way. That is, instead of the kind of security priorities of the West being a kind of, standoff with the communist world, there were going to be shared security priorities globally, which were going to embody more liberal values because they were going to be dealing with, collective problems, which were seen first and foremost as mass atrocities. This was the decade of Bosnia, Rwanda, the development of the International Criminal Court, the idea of responsibility to protect. This was the kind of values element which it was hoped would kind of come to infuse the international order. So how did this all play out? Well, I want to point up a few trends that I think are worth noticing. First, the settlement within Europe really was a striking success. Europe was, with American support, united and kind of anchored in democratic capitalist systems. But one of the consequences of this success is that Europe no longer began to look like the front line from an American point of view. And this is combined with the fact that the rest of the bet didn't really pay off. So that while Europe did kind of consolidate, more broadly across the world, the kind of form of convergence that people were hoping didn't happen. And so the United States, I think, found itself facing, a series of new threats in which the countries that it was confronting actually, in many cases, were becoming more powerful, partly as a result of the kind of benefits of global interdependence, and the kind of economic interlinkages were strengthening these countries, but they weren't converging. So from the point of view of the United States, Europe looked a little bit less like the center of action, and more like something which was perhaps time that the Europeans began to look after themselves a little bit more. Europe was rich, it was whole, it was free, it was no longer the kind of venue for a superpower standoff. And the United States was facing other challenges, other forms of competition, and here was the pivot to Asia was a kind of exemplification of this pursued by the Obama administration. So this is a kind of long-term historical trend resulting partly from the success of certain aspects of the liberal project and the failure of other aspects of the liberal project. But it's something that certainly predates Trump. And I think was very visible during the Obama administration. There was this feeling that the Europeans had to take more of a share in solving the problems of their own neighborhood, and that the US, it was time for the US to pursue its interests elsewhere. And there was this sense, I think, that the kind of security umbrella which had really preserved and saved Europe during the first period of liberal international order was somehow kind of infantilizing Europe during the second period. That, I think that was, as I say, an underlying trend which was pulling to some degree the kind of two pillars of the liberal international order in different directions. And from a European standpoint too, I think there was, this kind of provoked a certain degree of ambivalence in Europe. And as with any kind of, those of us who have families will recognize this, that the kind of the children in their dependent position both want to be independent and they want to be protected. And there was a little bit of that, I think, going on in the European mindset as well during this period. Also, I'm afraid it was kind of partly helped by the fact that it turned out that the Europeans weren't actually able to solve all the problems in their neighborhood on their own. Partly because of a lack of military capacity, so that the intervention in Libya in 2011 was supposed to be a kind of a European operation where the Americans would just kind of, kick it off and then stand back. But the Europeans proved to be unable to actually manage it militarily on their own, and so the Obama administration ended up being more pulled in than it wanted to be. So, there was this attempt to kind of pull back, and nevertheless, I think, as that episode showed, security cooperation was continuing. There was a strong degree of still a security alliance that was also very visible in the fight against ISIS. But there was also a degree of tension that was kind of creeping in, I think, and this was particularly in the way they interpreted this kind of values agenda, partly because the Europeans are convinced institutionalists, and the United States, as we know, has a kind of very strong cultural resistance in its political culture to the idea of kind of international law and international accountability and supervision of what the United States is doing, whereas from a European, from the standpoint of European history, external legal rules were something that would save Europeans from the kind of darker tendencies within their own continent, or something which for the United States was simply outside the realms of their experience. But even beyond that, and here I'm also going to echo what you said, I think during this period, even apart from the kind of pushback against the liberal order, there was just, I think, a recognition that some of our aspirations about rolling out these kinds of protective values internationally proved to be a lot harder than we had hoped. So to my mind, Syria, for instance, proves two things. Certainly the conflict was complicated by the fact that so many outside powers were so heavily involved, and it did become a kind of arena for the contest of proxy forces. But it also suffered because there was simply no conviction among Western powers that military intervention was going to be able to solve a problem that was as complicated as this. So I think these two things came in together. And again, this was a problem that existed before Trump, I think, a kind of chastened sense that some of the problems that we're facing, are just a lot harder. We see even before the US came in, I think we saw a kind of a sense that the international justice project perhaps had more kind of internal tensions than we had thought. There was some ambiguity about the goals of intervention in Libya. Can responsibility to protect really be divorced from a kind of political agenda so that it can be internationally neutral? All of these kinds of problems were also coming up. What's new, I think, in Trump, and I'll be quick because this is not so different from what others said, but I'm going to put a different emphasis on it. I think three elements. First of all, is his vision of the national interest. I said that the United States' interests were to some degree diverging from Europe, and that it was probably necessary and inevitable that that would happen. But Trump added to this a particularly narrow vision of the American national interest that really didn't see any benefit to international institutions or alliances or international cooperation more broadly. Secondly, which I think is quite a striking departure, Trump seems completely untouched by any notion of American exceptionalism. The idea that the US should kind of exemplify and demonstrate certain values, either promoting them in its foreign policy or even kind of standing back and exemplifying them as a kind of magnetic force domestically. He really doesn't share that. And that's, from a European standpoint, is the first kind of American president since World War II, I think, who hasn't come in with this kind of vision. And in this way, for me, a kind of a really telling statement that he made. He was being challenged at one point about, why aren't you more critical of the behavior of the Russians or other countries or whatever? And he said, look, the United States is, we're no angels either. And, I mean, it was kind of course, historically quite true, but, or true to some degree, I guess, in that, America doesn't have a spotless record, of course. And yet this was a kind of extraordinary thing to hear an American president saying. And so that aspect that, that you have more in common with countries like your European allies who share a certain kind of commitment to certain vision, ideals, than you do, say, with Egypt under President Sisi or, the Philippines under Duterte. That is really lacking in kind of Trump's presentation of his vision of America. And thirdly is the sheer unpredictability of American foreign policy. And this is the disappearance of the United States globally, again, you said. But, from a European standpoint, this is really striking. America is just kind of absent in the kind of, there's a global kind of diplomacy deficit, I think, because of the lack of any kind of consistent and principled, engaged American leadership that kind of can be relied on. And you know, all of this is really unsettling, and I think if you look in the Middle East, you can see the consequences of this beginning to play out. So, you know, very briefly, where does this all leave Europe? You know, I think, you know, it's possible, although it would be depressing, for America to become a kind of conventional great power that didn't have an exceptional vision. Whether the public would go along, I defer to others. But, you know, the US could get away with it as being just the most powerful kind of assertive nationalist out there. But Europe simply can't play that role. It doesn't have the kind of military culture or military organization to do that. And I think there's something about the kind of entire structure of the EU and the European project that means it simply can't go down that road. You know, and so you have the Europeans beginning to explore the idea that maybe they're going to have to fend for themselves a bit more. And you had Chancellor Merkel in Germany saying, you know, the days when we can rely on others are to some extent over. But, you know, I think there's a limit to what Europe can do on its own. And so I think what we're going to get is a mix. We're going to get, you know, to some degree, continued security cooperation in the areas of counterterrorism and those kinds of things. I think the security ties are so close that they will continue. And also in practice, the US hasn't really pulled back on these security commitments, despite the uncertainty created by its rhetoric. You know, then I think in the economic arena, we'll see more European independence. This is one field where Europe really probably can go on its own. It, you know, it has a significantly large economy. It can sort of set standards globally through its trading agreements. And here I think we're going to see more divergent European behavior and some European-US clashes in terms of trade, in terms of regulation, and so on. Third, I think we're going to see a kind of opportunistic opening to other powers. This, again, matches what you were saying in other areas. You know, climate, the Europeans are going to start talking to China. In terms of peacekeeping, in terms of migration, the Europeans are going to be looking for options where they can. And fourth, the Europeans have to try and solve their problems on their own a bit more because they're kind of the domestic settlement is challenged in Europe as much as it is in America. And that's going to be Europe's position, but I think they're going to be mostly in a policy of trying to wait this out and trying to hope that America comes back at least halfway to where it is before. But what I tried to indicate in my remarks is that I think, you know, the Europeans would be wrong to hope, and I think probably will realize not to hope, that America will come back to where it was before. But hopefully it'll come halfway back from where it is now. Thank you.
Mr. Wojciechowski.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I can start, and when you will put on my presentation. Thank you very much, Anastasia. Yes, I have it. Yeah. Thank you. I understand that it's Saturday night, and you are tired because of 2 days of presentations and discussions and sessions. But I'll try to make you not very dull, but a little bit dull with some figures and tables. Yes. I will talk about the future. I will be cruel. I will talk about the future because at MMO we are doing a lot of forecasting. Every year we are issuing and we're publishing our annual forecast, Russia and the world for the next year, where we're analyzing trends in world economy and international relations. And every 5 years we are publishing strategic global forecast for next 15 years. If you are doing forecasting, you need figures. You need to analyze something very, very specific and very concrete, because in another way it will be speculation, it will be futurism, it will be fantasy, but not prognosis, but not forecasting. So the role of the United States in the world will depend very much in the next 10, 15 years on many significant factors. But all these factors will be backgrounded with trends in world economy and international trade, investment, and everything like that. We hear a lot about multipolar system. I prefer another world, polycentric. Yes, there are trends towards polycentrism in the development of the international system. And this polycentrism cannot be reduced to the group of new centers in terms of major powers in the world economy and international politics. It is polycentric, which means it has much more centers inside countries, like big cities, like centers of growth, like enclaves of economic development, even sometimes if in not so developed countries. It means that it is becoming polycentric in terms of structure and in terms of interaction and systems of interaction between among states and other actors, in terms of development of transnational enterprise, which right now is developing not only in the developed world, not only in the Western world, but also in the new transnational enterprises coming from countries which are becoming new leaders of the world economy. But anyway, this emerging polycentric system is the system where the United States should be ready to interact and should be ready also to interact with the new rules, with the new actors, and this system is becoming more and more complicated. As we have discussed today on the previous session devoted to the international system and the future of liberal world order, this system is becoming more and more interdependent. Because globalization is an obvious fact. We have globalization in finance, we have globalization in trade, we have globalization in investments, and we have globalization in technology and social transformations. But at the same time, the critical question about globalization, to which extent its major stakeholders will be ready to become responsible regulators, to which extent they will be ready to not only to get benefits from globalization, but also to have responsibilities. This is a critical question for the future of U.S. Foreign policy and for U.S. economic development. Because on the one hand, the United States will continue to be, as you see here in the figures, which are describing current situation, the United States are continuing to be one of global economic leaders and the strongest one. But on the other hand, the United States are transforming. The world economy is transforming. And to which extent the United States will be ready to be responsible participant of a global economic system and not to use its status of leading power to reduce opportunities for other actors is a critical question. And to my mind, with development of this new world economy in which not Western countries will have stronger positions, the opportunities, the window of opportunities for the United States to play this role of responsible stakeholder and responsible leader can be reducing, because other countries are becoming competitors, and especially China. So if we will look attentively to current structure of the world economy, even in terms of GDP, which is specific indicator, not really respected by all economists, we will see that it is becoming not only polycentric, but inside this polycentric, it is becoming trilateral, with special role of the United States, of European Union, and China. So, in the next future, 2030 is not so far. According to estimates of our institute, the share of world GDP will look like this in terms of percents. You see, the United States and the EU are still leading, but China is will gain much more power in terms of figures of GDP. Of course, the quality of GDP and the quality of production, the technological level of production such indicators like GDP per capita are also significant. But you see that this is world economy in which others will play more and more significant role. I'm not so happy with the figures of Russia, but anyway, it's figures we have according to our estimates of speed of growth of Russian economy. We have about 2% a year. It's not enough. But anyway, even taking into account a very conservative forecast, we will have about 4% of world GDP. But China will have 24, more than 24. And it's the new reality in which the United States are entering. The critical question, to which extent economic interdependence between the United States and China will prevent escalation of political conflict and military confrontation. Here you see only one indicator, US-China trade. You see that whatever Donald Trump is saying, the dynamics are positive. He promised to reduce Chinese presence on American market, but the trade deficit is growing. And the same picture you can see in the figures of investments. I do not have them here, but there are very different figures about the amount of Chinese investments in the United States and a more clear picture about US investments in China. But because we need to take into account offshores, we need to take into account and investments, Chinese investments coming from offshores and American investments coming to China through offshores. We need to take into account Hong Kong as a very specific zone. And I know that according to American statistics, Hong Kong is counted as a separate country, even taking into account that it's part of China now. And we need to take into account money of Chinese diaspora. This is the most complicated thing about Chinese-American relations and Chinese and economic ties between China and the United States. Another figure which another table which contains figures about trade between EU and the United States is also showing us very interesting trends. You know, the amount of trade is growing from time to time. It is falling down, then it is growing again. Now it is growing again, together world economy. But to which extent the United States will be ready to follow this, line of developing trade and investment practices and trade and investment as a continuous priority in terms of relations with EU. Of course, we see that in the security sphere, NATO is, going through its revival, and it's becoming less political organization and more military bloc again. But in terms of trade and investment, Obama was trying to build these two great projects, TTP and Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. And he saw it as one of his principal legacies of his presidency. We saw what has happened to TPP. It was rational or not, I do not know, but China was happy with it. I do not know if many US companies were, but for Europe, this project of Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership and its future and its realization is one of critical issues. Will relations between the United States and Europe become, sustainably developing, or they will be influenced by practices of trade wars, growing tariffs, and breaking interdependence? It's a critical question not only for the United States and Europe, but also for Russia and EU, because for decades Russia has been one of major trade partners of EU. Before the crisis in our relations, our trade with the European Union reached figures of about 400 billions of US dollars. Now it is a little bit more than 220. And of course, you see how politics can break economic ties and production chains. For Russia and for European Union, for the United States, it's a critical issue. To which extent we will be ready to sacrifice economic rationality to political ambitions? Or we will continue this war of sanctions, exchange of sanctions, or we will try to rely on private enterprise to restore our relations. It's a critical question. We hear a lot about positive dynamics of US-India economic ties and US-India new political and security dialogue. Of course, in the sphere of politics, this dialogue is significant, and we saw meetings, and we saw visits, and we saw exchanges of promises. But in the sphere of trade, in the sphere of investments, I do not see the perspective which in US-India relations, which US-China relations are having and will have. It's a critical question for declared Indo-Pacific foreign policy, which has been declared recently by Rex Tillerson and then President Trump. And it's also significant not only for China, for India and the United States. It's also significant for China, which is the major trade partner of India and major trade partner of the United States. It's significant for Russia, which is trying to build new economic ties with India and restore economic relations and political dialogue we used to have. To which extent Russia will be seen in this system of relations as a competitor to the United States or a collaborator which is ready to work with India together with the United States? It's also a critical question. And the last table I want to show you is showing long-term trends in the growth of military expenditures. So you see, during a little bit less than a decade, how changes the figures of military budgets of many countries. You know, some figures are here according to official statistics, some are according to SIPRI, Stockholm Institute of Problems of Peace, one of the most leading analytical structures which is which is focused on the military expenditures, military economic issues, conflict resolutions, and conflicts in the world. So you see the statistics, and you see the trends. And will these trends prevail, and the arms race in Asia especially, will it prevail over economic interdependence? Or butter will still beat guns? It's a critical question for US foreign policy. With what China the United States will work in the next decade? With China with growing military budget, or with China with growing trade deficit with the United States and with a significant amount of investment and one of significant foreign keepers of American foreign debt? It's a critical question for not only for the current Trump's administration, but maybe for the next administration, whatever it will be, Republican or Democratic, or administration which will come in the next decade. And this is critical question, how the United States will behave in the world which is becoming not so friendly for the United States. If we take into account current trends in international politics, how we need to think how the international system will look like. Maybe it can be a really polycentric international system based on global institutions, the rule of law, and positive dynamics in international trade and economic development. Or it can become bipolar system with China and Russia on one side and the United States and NATO allies on another side. We played this game. Why we should play it again with new actors? So thank you very much.
I would now like to open up the floor for our panelists to engage in discussion together. So if you have any questions, we'd really love to hear them.
Main questions of each other.
If not, I can start out and ask you guys a question. So what, if any, positive effects could the retreat of US-led liberalism have on the world, or more specifically, American citizens?
Okay, everyone's looking at me, sure. The one possible advantage you could argue would be that the U.S. would be less likely to engage in military adventurism elsewhere, which would obviously mean less of a cost to the United States in terms of blood and treasure if there was turmoil in the rest of the world. That's making a fairly healthy number of assumptions, though, and there's ways in which I don't believe that. You know, Trump, for a lot of, you can say a lot of things about the sort of populist nationalism that Trump embodies. In terms of the use of force, you can argue that they are far more critical of the idea of the U.S. using force to, let's say, sustain the liberal international order. But they are, to use the language of Walter Russell Mead, they're Jacksonians, which means that if they see a threat, they will act unilaterally rather than multilaterally, and without necessarily any concern about the sort of laws of war. And that doesn't necessarily work out well for either the United States or the countries that we're attacking. So, I mean, again, the charitable answer to your question is we might be less adventurous. And again, you can say, you know, what you will about the Trump administration, but he hasn't invaded a new country, you know, which presidents are off to do in their first 2 years of office. So, you know, props to him for that. But
he's got some months left there.
Exactly, that's true. That's true. So I'll leave it at that.
I guess I have a couple of additional sort of glass half full observations. The first of which is that I think, as I said, that this idea of the retreat of American liberalism has become so pronounced and so glaring that I think it has removed a sense of complacency in a lot of quarters, including in other countries that might complain about this or that aspect of American leadership, but actually, when you scratch beneath the surface, are really hungry for America's presence in the world and don't want to see it removed. And I think that in some ways is the flip side of this U.S. retreat. I think it's a very funny thing. In general, in a hegemonic system, smaller countries shop for venues and look for somewhere else to go, and they wish that they didn't have to deal with this sort of American monopoly of power. But in this sort of hegemonic system, Trump seems to be the one who's kind of looking for other places to go. Surely there must be some alternative to the system of American leadership that's been created, to NAFTA or the Iran deal or the climate change. And I think he's looking for somewhere else to go because he's looking for leverage, A, because he doesn't necessarily like the agreements, but B, because he's looking for leverage in a negotiation. And he's trying to say, I'm willing to walk away, right? And that's a very tempting thing. And something that he has in common with President Obama was that he disliked the inability of the United States to get other countries to share burdens with the United States. And I think the fact is, these countries are sufficiently spooked by Trump that there's a degree of leverage in this idea that maybe we're just crazy enough to pull out of NAFTA. Maybe we should try to find something to do about it. Or maybe we're just crazy to pull out of the Iran deal. We should find something to do about it as a kind of leverage. And yet the cost to that is tremendous because of the hedging that it invites in all quarters, and the folks who feel that, around the world, who feel that maybe they shouldn't bet their literal physical safety on us, as many, many countries do. So it's, again, the glass half empty, glass half full, but I do think that he's created some leverage for the United States by suggesting that we have somewhere else to go besides the system of leadership that we created.
I'd add one more thing, which my fellow Dan pointed out, or sort of reminded me, which is, if you want to talk about in terms of the possible effects of Trump on the American public, you can actually argue that paradoxically Donald Trump has made the liberal international order great again, which is to say that if you look at public attitudes about the components of that order, the alliance system, feelings about trade, feelings about immigration, the truth is that most Americans were largely okay with it, but it wasn't necessarily, they weren't enthusiastic, whereas the opponents were extremely energized in their opposition to it. The one thing about Trump being president is that now, in some ways, the entire country is now witnessing the counterfactual in front of our eyes, which is what happens if we deviate from that. And if you take a look at the polling evidence, the remarkable thing about this is the degree to which Americans become more enthusiastic about alliances, more enthusiastic about free trade, more enthusiastic about immigration. Now, part of that is due to polarization, but I think part of it is also sort of that Americans took this system for granted for a long period of time and only saw the negatives. And now they're beginning to see why that system was potentially valuable as well.
And I would say quickly, you see some similar effect in Europe. That is to say that the election of Donald Trump has, led to an increase in support in a number of European countries for the European ideal, because they thought, and I think there is also an element among European policymakers about this. We are kind of a little bit more on our own now. We do have to get a bit more serious about some of the kind of foreign policy questions that we've put off, really facing up to for much too long anyway. And as I suggested in my talk, I think that will only get Europe so far, but it still is an overdue, development, and to that extent, it's good. Similarly, I think the forces of populism in Europe haven't gone away; they remain reasonably strong, but they perhaps were kind of slightly set back by the negative example of Trump.
We would now like to invite members of the audience to ask questions. So there are 2 aisle mics. We ask that you line up behind those. To ensure that we are able to address the maximum number of questions, we ask that you keep your questions to under a minute and pose 1 question to 1 panelist. Please also state your name.
My name is Tim Lane. Thanks for the great presentations, and sorry for reading. But to yourself, Dr. Dresner, and to the others, other than the dynamically staffed Trump administration and leftover pro-liberal international order technocrats in Washington, D.C. or otherwise, what are some of the diplomatic, social, or economic influences from the United States that could continue to promote the international order while we are in the midst of the Trump administration? Liberal international order.
Got it. So, I mean, I think there are a couple of things that you can reference. On the governmental side, it's worth noticing that, one of the advantages that people are discovering about the U.S. Constitution is the way in which it decentralizes power in the U.S. government, both in terms of different branches of government and also the federal government versus the states. So what you're seeing now is, countries like Canada and Mexico, for example, bypassing Washington and going literally to mayors or governors in places when it comes to things like climate change as a way of trying to get those units of government to adhere or agree to adhere to the Paris Climate Change Accord. So there's those elements of sort of subnational parts of the U.S. government. The other aspects, I think, in which that matter in terms of promoting the liberal international order is, first of all, civil society. America's a complex country. We, on the one hand, elected, Donald Trump, but we also elected Barack Obama before him. And indeed, there were a fair number of people who voted for both of those guys. And so, the very fact that Donald Trump was inaugurated, then the day after you had possibly the largest sort of social movement in this century, go on to, the nation's streets, and then come again a year later, relatively active, demonstrates the complexity that is the United States. And so, the degree to which social movements in the United States talk to others matters. And then the last thing is going to sound, a little trivial, but I think is important, is popular culture. If you talk about Joe Nye's concept of soft power, Part of it is the policies we articulate, part of it is the values we articulate, but part of it is the culture that we export. And, you know, we're still reasonably good at that part. And that's not necessarily going to go away anytime soon.
Good evening. I'm Praye from the Singapore delegation. Thank you very much for sharing your insights tonight. My question is for the panel in general. Given in the 2016 presidential election, President Trump, until recently a Democrat, ran as a Republican and siphoned off votes in traditional Democratic regions such as Wisconsin and Michigan, while having political positions across the spectrum. Do you think we are heading towards a permanent shift from the left-right politics and ideological orthodoxy to something else, or is this just merely a one-off phenomenon? Thank you.
Go ahead. Oh, well, yeah. I think that all these elections, I'm looking from outside, so all these elections was a phenomenon. Not only because of Donald Trump, but because of Bernie Sanders also. It's the first time when people with radical positions are gaining such high support in American history, to my mind. On the one hand, Donald Trump, who is not Republican. Every Republican will tell you that Donald Trump is something else. And on the other hand, Bernie Sanders, who is not Democrat in its ideological understanding, but he's social Democrat. He's closer to European social democrats, and he's more leftist than Obama, much more. And the phenomenon of Bernie Sanders didn't allow Hillary Clinton to consolidate Obama's coalition. And to my mind, it's a trend. And to my mind, on next American elections, we will see something very interesting. Russians are promising.
Oh, boy.
Thank you.
Watch out. I'm going to leave that last comment, but get to
Russians
the earlier.
have big plan.
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
Tell Dean Stavridis. On a more serious note, I do think that there's something happening in terms of the ideological alignments, and I think that part of what is becoming clear is that what had manifest as a fight about the size of government over these last 40 years is increasingly a kind of cultural clash between different conceptions of U.S. identity, different conceptions of who should spend money, when, and how. One conception of a kind of cosmopolitan country focused on a certain set of Americans, and another with a very different immigration policy and a different kind of social identity and prioritization. And so I think that, yeah, increasingly these what seemed like public policy disputes feel more like cultural disputes, and that will cause some significant realignment within both parties. And I also think neither party is really ready to deal with the amount of economic upheaval that is coming in the next 10 years in terms of the automation and AI and other kinds of changes. The sort of small government orthodoxy doesn't get you there, but neither does the generation of folks who are basically leaving the scene in the Democratic Party with a significant question as to who will constitute and define the leadership that follows them. So I do think there's at least some significant room for political realignment. And on foreign policy, there already, I think, has been one to a significant extent. Trump, having kind of captured a significant chunk of the Republican voters to his foreign policy idea, has left the Republican internationalist, hawkish elites in Washington largely sort of shaking their heads and alienated at this sort of never-Trump spot where they can't be hired by the administration to fill it out. And they seem to feel somewhat like the Game of Thrones houses who decide that they're going to band with the other houses to fight off the White Walkers beyond the wall, who are the sort of isolationists. So there are those alignments in some ways are already happening. As to whether they can really create a third party or just sort of redefine the battleground between the two that already exists, probably the latter. But it is a pretty significant change.
Good evening. My name is Kai. I'm a senior at Tufts University. Firstly, I want to thank all the panelists for joining us tonight. My question is directed specifically to Mr. Ben-Haim. One question, one sort of central theme to this symposium that I think, at least I keep coming back to, is the sort of insularity of the American foreign policy establishment, national security establishment, and sort of the inability at times for the American administration to connect its policies on sort of a broader national security scale to the interests of the average American middle-class citizen. Given your time in the Obama administration, if you were to go back, can you think of anything that the administration could have done to sort of sell the liberal world order a little bit better, or would it have mattered if the Obama administration could have sold it any better? Thank you.
It's a great question, even if it violates my hope that people would ask the difficult questions to Fyodor and the others instead. I think that the Obama administration had an attitude about foreign policy and about the politics of foreign policy that was sort of forged, like so much of Obamaism, in the crucible of the run-up to the Iraq War, when they saw other Democrats following along with this sort of hawkish drumbeat of a rush to war to seem credible, to seem serious, to seem, and these guys said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to use our good sense. He said, I'm not opposed to all wars. I'm opposed to dumb wars, was Obama in 2002 as a state Senate candidate. You know, and so there was a sort of proud defiance of the politics of the war on terror, and what Obama called Jeffrey Goldberg in probably the single best interview. If anyone is looking to understand Obama foreign policy, go find his interview with Jeffrey Goldberg. He called it the Washington Playbook. And somehow it's like a sort of choose your own adventure, but every path leads to using force, right? And it's, you know, well, you have some problem you can't solve, use force. You know, you want to demonstrate your strength, use force. And I think he felt very much that politics of foreign policy needed to be, the Americans needed to be disabused of that. And so I think there was a sense that we know better, and you're afraid, yeah, you know, you're being told by Fox News that an Ebola carrying Mexican ISIS guy is coming across the border, you know, to marry your daughter, and you know, and
you gotta recruit your daughter
or your son, and you know, and be afraid, be very afraid, right? And so I think there is a sense that that had to be kind of just ignore that. Just put that to one side and let serious people make serious decisions. And we're underweighted in the Middle East, or we're overweighted in the Middle East and underweighted in Asia. And it doesn't matter who goes on TV and who beheads who. That's just the reality behind it. It doesn't matter what, you know, little things are happening. That's this sort of Olympian, kind of Spockian, almost sort of detached view. And I think part of what I was saying earlier when I was saying we need a little bit more politics in our foreign policy was that it can't, that kind of technocratic rationale doesn't fully get you there. It probably, in retrospect, had Obama, I would have probably admired him less had he done it, but had he said in that summer when we were dealing with unaccompanied minors across the border and the Crimea crisis and the beheadings by ISIS, you know, if at that moment he had somehow performed a little bit more of the sort of macho theater of traditional, like, you know, get off my plane, American president, you know, stuff, hawkishness, maybe that would have reassured the American public in a way. So yeah, I'm open to that critique and that idea, and I certainly think going forward, I hope we can find a way to re-politicize foreign policy in the ways that Professor Dresner described to make people feel passionately invested in an internationalist consensus that doesn't sort of only rely on the reptilian part of the brain that sort of wants to you know, to like kill the home invader and can see some sort of a more kind of generous, capacious, kind of spiritual, moral, you know, view of what America can do in the world. So yes, we could have done better, I guess, in short.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Woltowski, I was wondering, just very simply, what do we get wrong about Russia? You know, how are our assumptions, you know, you as someone who listens to American academia and media, what are some assumptions that we make about Russia that are just simply wrong?
Just one example from the recent time.
A lot of Western media paid attention that in his speech towards Parliament, President Putin announced some new nuclear systems and some new missiles. But they are not taking into account that we are standing in front of a collapse of two regimes, very significant for arms control in general. And to my mind, President Putin was trying to negotiate with the West, especially with the United States, on these two issues. Because before that, the nuclear posture review has been published, and there were also new systems announced, and possibility of continuing of START treaty signed in Prague in 2009 has mentioned, but nothing else. And right now, in 2021, the current START treaty is ending. And the critical question is, will we sign the new START treaty or not? Or we will try to prolong this one for 5 years more. It can be prolonged. Taking into account criticism which President Trump during his election campaign expressed about current START treaty, Russia is puzzled if the United States are really interested in having a START treaty with Russia and negotiations about it. And taking into account the investments to developing the nuclear arsenal, which Donald Trump has promised and is studying right now, and which is a grand plan according to nuclear posture review. Russian officials are puzzled what we're entering to right now, the new arms race. The second thing, which is significant not only for the United States and Russia, but also for Europe, for EU, is the future of INF treaty. Will we, now we are accusing each other, Russia and the United States, in violating INF treaty. I think that the United States have done much more on this way, accusing Russia in violating INF treaty. Russia also has something to say about it. But the critical question is not who is guilty, but the critical question, will we return to 1983 or 1984 in terms of intermediate and short-range missiles in Europe, and how it will influence on European security and global security in general, and how will we, Russia and the United States, engage other members of nuclear club to some new reductions and arms control regime. This is critical thing, and it's just one example how Russia can be misunderstood in many ways. And I know, taking into account previous experience, I know that that Vladimir Putin's style and Russian political style of negotiating is always starting with rising stakes on public level and talking about very specific things and very rational and pragmatic approaches to resolve issues on a diplomatic level. So let's see.
Hi, thanks for all the panelists for coming out tonight. My name is Layla, I'm a third-year student, I'm part of EPIIC. My question is directed at Professor Dresner. So you mentioned that something is going to go wrong with this car going down. I'm not asking you to predict the disasters, but I wonder what would you draw a line as the red line event in the Trump administration in the coming years, and given the context that would it be a public blasé about this is like Trump could do weirder things and we just don't care anymore, and what would really go wrong, especially for example the recent his remarks about tariffs and trade wars are easy to win. If a trade war occurs, is that a red line event?
I'm sorry, I'm trying to figure out how to answer this without profanity. So there are three things that I think, there are three ways that I think the car can break down. The first is what you mentioned, which is the tariffs, or rather a larger trade war. Now there are ways, even in this week in which it was announced, a lot of people pointed out, well, wait a minute, this is hardly the first time a president has launched this kind of, has slapped tariffs on steel. That's what George W. Bush did in 2002. So maybe we're getting exercised over nothing. That said, there are a few big differences. The first is that when Bush did that, he did it as a campaign promise, but when the WTO ruled against him, he was perfectly happy to withdraw it. He fulfilled his campaign promise. He was by and large a free trader, and most of the rest of the world acknowledged that he was a free trader. Trump genuinely is not a free trader. Trump does not believe in the idea of free trade. And so the problem is that this isn't thought of as the, with Bush, that was thought of as the exception and not the rule. This is the rule for Trump. And it's a question of how much he's going to be able to do it. And the second was the provision of U.S. trade law that he exercised to use this in terms of technicalities, which is he didn't use a safeguards provision, he used a national security provision. And that in some ways opens up a Pandora's box, both because it's not clear if the WTO will be able to overrule him on this. And if they do overrule him, then that leads to the interesting question of whether Trump would comply, which is a really disturbing, possible implication. But the other issue is the degree to which other countries now might be emboldened to try to use national security waiver, national security type excuses for their trade barriers. So yeah, this is one thing that concerns me, whether this is essentially the tipping point for a return to out-and-out protectionism. Second is North Korea, just because that's the, a continuing crisis and one in which it's not obvious to me what the administration's policy actually is. There might be multiple administration policies on this. And so it becomes, the degree to which Trump believes that the problem with U.S. foreign policy before him was we didn't have enough tactical surprise. And we really needed to sort of keep people off balance. And that's the way you achieve a foreign policy victory. Overlooks the massive number of ways in which what matters to the United States is its ability to credibly commit to other countries. And you can't, it's really hard to combine those two. And so I'm worried Trump will stumble into a conflict there. And the third thing is what we don't know. It's to quote Donald Rumsfeld, is the known unknown crisis. Trump has been awful during crises. No, seriously, think about this. Think about how he handled Parkland. Think about how he handled, the hurricane in Puerto Rico. Think about, I'm trying to think if there's another crisis that he hasn't handled terribly well. Nothing big comes to mind, I guess. But the point is that if there is an actual crisis that genuinely threatens, U.S. security interests, I'm not sure he's got the temperament to be able to cope with that. And I'm not sure he's got a foreign policy team that trusts each other enough to be able to implement something well. So, I mean, imagine, if you've had to read 13 Days by by Robert Kennedy, or imagine, the way John F. Kennedy, convened XCOM. Imagine what the Trump XCOM would look like. I mean, seriously, it would be, it would be a great reality show, no denying that. But it would be a disaster in terms of policy.
Thank you.
Yeah. So my question is, some of the other panels have spoken about R2P and that impacting the liberal order. Something that's been mentioned multiple times is there's the hard balance of responsibility versus national sovereignty. The U.S. has domestically had to deal with it. So if there should be a need for a change in the liberal order in that respect, in terms of, say, the United Nations power, can the U.S. adapt, do you think? This is, I guess, for Dresner or Benin, Givno, or whoever.
Yeah. I guess you're saying, could the U.S. be, as it were, left behind by more of a shift towards this kind of institution, and where would the U.S. go?
Especially given that the U.S. has its own domestic issues with that balance.
Yeah. I mean, I think, it's an interesting question. And I think it's a question which, a few years ago was quite a live question. I think, unfortunately, the trends now are more in the direction of, restraining our expectations about what these institutions are going to achieve in the shorter term. And so, I think, my own sense of where the kind of international justice movement is heading is towards, a shift away from. I think there was this kind of anomalous period where, these kind of international justice tools were being used quite actively by the Security Council, and at the same time as the kind of 3 out of the 5 permanent Security Council members were themselves not part of the regime, not only the United States but Russia and China, not having not ratified the Rome Statute, and nevertheless they were using it to refer the case of Darfur in Sudan or refer Libya to the International Criminal Court, and I think that was setting up a tension. But my sense is that we may see less of that. So there hasn't been a referral of Syria to the International Criminal Court, for instance. And I think, my guess is that the system of international justice is going to evolve into a kind of longer-term backstop protection, where the countries that are parties to the court will come under its jurisdiction. It may take a while for cases to come to it, but it'll be there, sort of setting a benchmark. But I think it's going to be in a kind of consolidation phase rather than an expansion phase, and I think that takes the pressure off countries like the United States that are resisting its sway at the moment.
This will be the last question.
Hello, my name is Arthur Bhargav, and I'm a first-year student and part of the EPIIC colloquium. So one of my fundamental critiques with the liberal world order is that this world order has never been for everyone in this world. So when you think about the liberal world order, I generally constrict it to the West and to the West. While thinking about this, how do we see the coming in of different value systems from India, Russia, China, and giving into the broader understanding of the world order? How do we see the polycentric world order now shaping the way the institutions are formed, or do we see both China and Russia and other nations across the world working in the same institutions which the United States at its hegemonic point formed? This question is general. Anyone of you can answer that. Thank you.
So I guess I would challenge the premise of your question, which is the notion that the liberal international order is, only for the West. That's certainly true, I think, in terms of its origins. I won't dispute that. But if you want to take a look at the post-Cold War period, that's also time, that's simultaneously where you see the largest expansion of the liberal international order, and it's also where you see the most drastic reduction of poverty in in world economic history. I don't think those two things are a coincidence. And indeed, that's one of the, and also further, you saw a decline actually in interstate conflict as well. And again, I don't think that's a coincidence either. So the notion that, only the West benefits from this kind of order, I think is a very dangerous assumption to make. And indeed, ironically, part of the reason you have, movements of populist nationalism in the West is the conviction that somehow the rest of the world has profited off this order at the expense of the West somehow. That's equally erroneous, I would argue, but the point is that I'm not sure I would accept the premise.
All right. Sorry.
Please.
I would like to add also that in terms of values, the UN Charter is having a lot of space to incorporate different systems of values. But if you will look attentively to, for example, American conservatives and Russian conservatives, you will find lots of in common. If you look attentively to, for example, Indian left liberals and, for example, Russian left liberals, you will find a lot of in common. And you know, it's a question of psychology much more than question of values. You know, of course, the group of non-Western powers will influence on the system of principles and understanding. But to my mind, many of principles on which UN Charter is based, for example, are not liberal. They're universal. Not liberal, not social, not communist. And Soviet Union was one of the countries which invested into the development of UN Charter. And the current world order, we're still having legacy of that world order. But the critical question, to which extent Western countries, and especially the United States as leader of Western world and of current world order, will be ready to be more flexible, to engage, you know, non-Western emerging powers to the system and to engage them as stakeholders of the world order. This question is critical. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would like to give a warm round of applause to our panelists to thank them for their time and critical insight.
Thank you very much, Dan.
I'd also like to thank the audience for coming and attending the panel. Sadly, this discussion also concludes the EPIIC Symposium for this year. The theme of the liberal world order ending is more pressing than ever, regardless of what side of the political or ideological spectrum you lie on. We hope that you have a better understanding of the challenges that rising powers have wrought and the effects of technology, multilateral problem solving, religion, populism, illiberal nations, and non-state actors have had on international relations. As I think back to my first week of classes at Tufts this year, I remember how I excitedly but apprehensively entered the EPIIC classroom for the first time. As you can imagine, I was taken aback by the sheer quantity of work that was needed. But one thought kept on popping up in the back of my head. If I can do this, I can do anything. When I think back to all the work that was put into the preparation of this symposium, I'm reminded of a quotation by David Livingstone that goes as follows. I determined never to stop until I had come to the end and achieved my purpose. This year, EPIIC taught the students in the class that we had to persevere, work hard, and collaborate as a team in order to prepare an event that would not only make us proud, but that would also serve a concrete purpose, which is to educate others about the challenges that the liberal world order is facing. We had to abandon our preconceived ideas and notions and make ourselves vulnerable in order to understand the complexities of our world. Of course, EPIIC would not have been possible without the help of Saida and Susan, who worked tirelessly to make the logistical side of the symposium come together. Stacy, thank you for taking photos and creating web material about us so that we can remember not only what we have learned and created this year, but also the friendships and memories that we will cherish. Heather, you are an inspiration. From helping us organize the entire course to setting up networking possibilities with the IGL alumni, from helping us stay on track while creating the symposium to ordering us food and pizza for our movie nights. You have been like family to us, and I don't think that we could ever thank you enough. Finally, Professor Williams, I cannot personally express my gratitude enough for your teachings this year, and I am sure that all of my EPIIC colleagues mirror my feelings. You have not only been an exemplary and exciting professor, helping us work through the contradictions in the liberal world order, but also a true friend. Every aspect of EPIIC has been an enriching experience, from sitting and conversing with you on the bus on the way back from the New Hampshire retreat, to listening to you passionately lecture about the United Nations in class. And on behalf of the entire EPIIC class, I would like to thank you for this year. Once again, thank you for coming to the EPIIC Symposium, and please consider attending and participating in EPIIC next year, which will continue this long-standing tradition of intellectual discourse and engaging multidisciplinary collaboration. Thank you.